And our mission at UCCS is to educate California's future leaders in politics and policymaking, and to make expertise available to decision makers here in the Capitol. Today I have the pleasure of introducing one of our UCCS emerging scholars, Zachary Bleemer. This award is going to recognize him for his excellence in graduate student research with direct impact on public policy. Zachary is a PhD candidate in economics and a National Academy of Education Spencer Dissertation Fellow at UC Berkeley. His research examines the long-run ramifications of young Americans' post-secondary education and specialization decisions, with a particular focus on university policies that promote socioeconomic mobility. And I'm going to bring him on up here in just a second, but just please join me in welcoming Zachary Bleemer to the center.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Thanks very much to all of you for being here. Thanks to the center for having me. What I'm going to talk to you about today is affirmative action, percent plans, and the value of a research university education. Let me start with the standard disclaimer that the conclusions of this research do not necessarily reflect the opinions or official positions of the University of California or the state of California. Okay, the research question that I'm going to talk to you about today is this. Who should have access to elite public research university education? And the policy debate here, I think, tends to fall along the following axis. So on the one side, you have advocates of test-based meritocracy. So these are individuals who think that the way that students should be provided access to research universities is through some sort of meritocracy, often using the SAT. This will guarantee that top students, who are the most prepared students for difficult coursework, are going to be provided access. And this might be good for future entrepreneurship and innovation for those students because they'll have had access to this education. It helps sort these highly successful high school students into impactful and highly cognitive careers, which will provide economic growth to the state. And this will incentivize K-12 student performance. Students will have to do well in school in order to, the idea being, in order to test well and end up in excellent research universities. So I think this test-based meritocracy argument finds its counterpoint in advocates what I'll call broad representation. So here the argument is that a large set of students, even if they are not the highest testing students, should be provided access to elite research universities. This might improve economic mobility by promoting through education, lower income students. It will help identify high ability students who may not have had the same resources available to them in their local high schools, but who will nevertheless be able to succeed at elite research universities. And benefits here could spill over to those students' families or communities in a way that will benefit the state. So I just wanted to lay out this policy axis and the arguments in favor of each side for the central reason that there's surprisingly little evidence for any of these arguments. There's no evidence for the majority of these arguments, at least in the sense of high quality empirical work. I'm going to focus on this argument in particular, the claim that broad representation, providing access to students with lower standardized test scores, will ameliorate and promote economic mobility for those students. And you can think of the challenge here as distinguishing between these two factors. On the one hand, providing access to excellent universities provides school quality to these disadvantaged students. Students may benefit from the greater resources available to them at selective research universities. On the other hand, there might be a concern about school fit. Lower testing students, who tend, and in particular, the lower income students or lower socioeconomic status students who are targeted by broad access admissions policies, those students may perform less well at the university. They may have a hard time fitting in. They may be more likely to drop out or choose easier majors. And this may cause long-run negative ramifications for those students. I'm going to do my best today to adjudicate between these two possibilities. What happens when lower tested students are provided access to elite research universities? The specific policy context that I'm going to talk you through is two access-oriented admissions policies implemented by the University of California starting in the late 1970s and in some cases up until the present day. So the policies that I'll talk you through are race-based affirmative action, which provided admissions advantages to primarily Black and Hispanic high school graduates in the state, and a program called eligibility in the local context, which guaranteed admission to many University of California campuses for a certain percent of students at every California high school, with the idea being to target students at lower performing high schools and guaranteeing them admission to elite universities. I won't say that much in terms of background about the University of California. I think this is a system that most people in the room are quite familiar with. But right, the University of California is the complete set of public research universities in the state of California, from its most selective Berkeley and UCLA campuses, but also including a sort of middle tier of campuses like San Diego and Davis, Irvine and Santa Barbara, and then somewhat less selective, but nevertheless highly ranked and highly selective research universities at Santa Cruz, Riverside, and Merced. So I'm going to analyze these two policies, and I'm going to ask three questions with each policy. First, just what was the policy? So you may all think that you have a sense, for instance, of how the university actually implemented race-based affirmative action. I'm just going to show you in the data just what it meant for these universities to implement this policy, and I think it may not be what you believe affirmative action actually looks like. After showing you what the policy practically did, I'll ask which and how many students benefited from the implementation of this admissions policy. So how many kids were brought in because this policy was in place, and who were those students? And then finally, I'm going to follow those students for 5 to 20 years after they enroll at the University of California. And I'm just going to ask what happened to them as a result of their selective research university enrollment. I'm going to be able to do this using a large database that I've collected in part with the help of the University of California to track these students over time. So the data that I'll be describing for you today first include complete undergraduate applications to the university for the 1995 to 2011 period. I have more recent records, but they're not going to be helpful for today's talk. And so these complete applications include information like students' hometowns, their SAT scores and high school GPAs, as well as which universities they applied to and where they were admitted. And then I'm going to link those applications to two outcome databases. The first is the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a national database covering nearly all American universities and nearly all enrollees at those schools that shows where these students actually ended up going to college, even if they didn't come to the University of California, and if those students earned undergraduate degrees, as well as following those students to graduate degree enrollment and graduate degree attainment. So I'll have a lot of national information about the educational outcomes of these students. And then I'll also link to employment records from the California Employment Development Department. So this allows me to observe for all applicants to the University of California, if they ended up being employed in the state of California, I'll observe their quarterly earnings and industry of work. So I'll be able to follow, for instance, in the case of affirmative action, students for about 20 years, even after they leave the university, to see what happens to them as the result of university enrollment. The two policies that I'll talk to you about, affirmative action and ELC, I'm going to study in different ways. So in the case of affirmative action, what I'm going to show you is difference in difference analysis around the 1998 cessation of affirmative action at the University of California. So again, as many of you likely know, the University of California started implementing affirmative action in the 1970s, but abruptly stopped implementing affirmative action in 1998 as a result of a 1996 ballot proposition that forbid the university from considering race or ethnicity in admissions. So what I'm going to do is compare students who applied to the university in the years leading up to the end of affirmative action and the years after affirmative action ended. I'll ask what happens to Black and Hispanic applicants relative to white and Asian applicants who are much less affected by this change in policy. What happens to the Black and Hispanic applicants who no longer have access to the University of California as a result of the end of its affirmative action policy. Then, in the second case, studying ELC, so as I mentioned, ELC guaranteed admission to a certain percent of students at each California high school. And what I'm going to do is show you what happened to students who nearly became ELC eligible but ended up just below their high school's threshold. And I'll compare them to students just above their high school's eligibility threshold, right? The kids just above it were provided access to nearly all of the University of California campuses, while the kids below it were not. They could still get into the campus, but not through this ELC program. Now, that's the only relevant distinction between these two groups of kids. They had almost identical high school grades, except one of them got a B+ instead of a B in 10th grade English, and that was enough to push their GPA just above a threshold such that they gained access to University of California campuses. And I'll show you what that looks like in a lot greater detail in several slides. Okay, so let me start by showing you how affirmative action worked at the University of California. From this point forward, I'm going to show you a lot of tables, charts. Let me explain to you how these ones work. So here on the x-axis, I'm plotting students' academic index score, AIS. So the way the university calculated the academic index is there in the lower right-hand corner. The university took all applicants to the school. They took their high school GPA, capped at 4, and multiplied by 1,000. So you got 4,000 points from GPA. And then they took your SAT 1s and SAT 2s. There were 5 exams required in 1995. Each exam was out of 800 points, and so 5 exams makes 4,000. So you multiply those scores just by 1, add your SAT scores to your multiplied high school GPA, you get an academic index. And this was the primary tool used by the University of California to admit students in 1995. So the way this works is that the blue dots are your likelihood of admission if you were white or Asian to UC Berkeley in 1995 by academic index. So you can see here's what Berkeley did. For students with very high academic indices, they were all guaranteed admission to the University of California, Berkeley. There's some threshold below which students had a chance of getting into Berkeley that declined as their academic index declined. And then there's some other threshold down here below which white and Asian students had essentially no chance of getting into UC Berkeley. Each year, Berkeley chose these thresholds so that they would end up with the right number of admits to the university. Now you can see the story looks quite different for the red dots, which represents the likelihood of admission for Hispanic and Black applicants to Berkeley. And I should emphasize, this is not a model, this is the actual data from 1995 admissions. So what you can see happens is that as the likelihood of admission for white and Asian students sharply declines for students with academic indices between 6,500 and 7,500, the guarantee of admission continues for Black and Hispanic students down about another 1,000 academic index points, and only then starts to decline. So taking this graph seriously, what you should see is that for students with an academic index score of 6,500, your likelihood of admission to Berkeley, if you were white or Asian, is approximately 5 to 10%. And your likelihood of admission, if you were Hispanic or Black, was roughly 100%. Now, you might have had a sense of the way affirmative action working as it's like a tie break between otherwise similarly qualified students. But that's not how affirmative action worked at the University of California in the 90s. Instead, affirmative action provided tremendously large admissions advantages to a large group of Black and Hispanic students. In particular, this group with academic indices here. Now, I'll show you how admissions works at 3 campuses: Berkeley, a highly selective campus, Davis, a somewhat less selective campus, and Riverside, still somewhat less selective. So at Davis, again, you can see pretty large admissions advantages being provided to a pretty large group of Black and Hispanic students. At Riverside, you can see essentially no Black or Hispanic students were being rejected at any academic index, conditional on applying to Riverside and being University of California eligible. You had to take certain courses in high school. Now, most white and Asian students were guaranteed admission up to some relatively low threshold, and then below that threshold, their likelihood of admission declined. So affirmative action radically changed a large number of students' likelihood of admission to the University of California. Here's another way of visualizing that same information. So if you focus on this black line here, the darkest line shows the admissions advantage that Black and Hispanic students had at, in this case, Berkeley, relative to white and Asian students by academic index. So you can see again, at the score 6,500, Black and Hispanic students in 94 and 95 had about a 90 percentage point admissions advantage at Berkeley. Now, they had no admissions advantage all the way at the top because all of these kids were getting in. There was no difference between underrepresented minority students and other students. And no advantage, or essentially no advantage at the bottom. Basically, all of those students were being rejected. So the darkest line is the advantage in 1994 and 1995. This was before the passage of Prop 209. Then in 1996 and 1997, Prop 209 is passed, but affirmative action is still in place. The university is still providing this admissions advantage. And you can see the line doesn't change very much, though it shifts a little bit rightward as Berkeley becomes more selective. And then starting in 1998, the university has to stop using race-based affirmative action. And so what you can see is that these two lighter lines are the 98-99 and 2000-2001 admissions advantages. Now, you'll see they're not zero. The reason they're not zero is that race is correlated with other student characteristics, like lower income status, that still had an admissions advantage for these students even after the end of race-based specific affirmative action. So these aren't zero, but you can see the advantages decline very precipitously at UC Berkeley. You can see the same trend at UC Davis. The advantages fall by about 75%. Somewhat interestingly, Riverside is a case where the advantage seems to fall earlier. So at Riverside, Black and Hispanic students had a substantial advantage in 94-95, and that advantage has almost completely disappeared by 96-97. In other words, Riverside largely ended its affirmative action program after the passage of Prop 209, but even before they had to end the program in 1998. There are several other campuses that follow a similar trend. So what I want you to take away from these two slides is that the way affirmative action worked was that the University of California provided very large admissions advantages to this targeted group of Black and Hispanic applicants to the university. How many students benefited from that admissions advantage? Well, we can just count the number of students who would have been admitted to the university if affirmative action was still in place in 1998 relative to the number of students who were actually admitted under the university's new policy. So the chart on the left here, on the right here just shows that relative to a 1997 baseline, Black and Hispanic students became substantially less likely to enroll at Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego. In fact, they became less likely to enroll at nearly all campuses, though it was especially focused at Berkeley and UCLA. And this adds up to about 700 students a year who would have otherwise enrolled at some University of California campus, but because of the end of affirmative action no longer did. So this is 700 Black and Hispanic students who disappear from the University of California rolls. Most of those students, in a net sense, were being pushed out of the Berkeley and UCLA campuses. So there was a 60% decline in the number of Black and Hispanic enrollees at Berkeley and UCLA from just 1997 to 1998 when the affirmative action program ended. But the way you should think about what's happening is that Berkeley and UCLA push out about 700 students. Those 700 students now enroll primarily at somewhat less selective University of California campuses, which admit this new group of students who used to go to Berkeley and UCLA, but then reject another 700 students who sort of filter down the list, right? The way that affirmative action, practically speaking, worked was that it just, by ending affirmative action, we pushed students down a selectivity spectrum, such that in the end, about 700 students were ultimately pushed out of the University of California system altogether. Who were those 700 students? They were all Black or Hispanic. They tended to be lower income than the average University of California student. They also tended to have relatively low SAT scores. Okay, so what happens to those students once they lose access to the university? So what I'm showing you here are these difference in difference estimates relative to a 1997 baseline. What happened to any given Black or Hispanic applicant to the University of California's likelihood of ever earning a graduate degree of any kind? And you can see leading up to affirmative action, there's basically no change. And then starting in 1998, these Black and Hispanic students become substantially less likely to ever earn a graduate degree. Why is this? Because they're no longer enrolling at the University of California, or they're enrolling at less selective campuses. And as a result, they're not moving on to earn graduate degrees, which could lead to long-run employment benefits. Similarly, on the right, you can see the change in students' average log earnings in their late 20s and early 30s. And you can see a similar decline. Each Black and Hispanic applicant to the University of California has earnings that are on the order of 0.07 log points, or about 7% lower just as a result of the end of affirmative action as a result of Prop 209 in university actions. You can see pretty substantial losses for these students. What does this suggest? It suggests that affirmative action was pulling in a disadvantaged group of students and providing them substantial benefits, such that once those benefits disappear as a result of Prop 209, there are substantial costs faced by these students. Here's just a last way of framing those estimates. So here what I'm going to do is show you what happened to Black and Hispanic applicants to the University of California's likelihood in their in each year after graduating university, or at least graduating high school, each year after, what happened to their likelihood of earning at least $100,000 a year in the state of California. So for instance, taking this number here, so 8 years after having graduated high school, the average Black or Hispanic applicant to the University of California became about a 0.5 percentage point less likely to earn $100,000 a year in the state. And you can see this all the way out to 19 years after the student leaves the university. So these are students, after the student leaves high school. So these are students who are on average 37 years old. And you can see they're substantially less likely now by a little more than 1 percentage point to earn $100,000 a year in the state. Now, these numbers might sound small, but remember, this is a negative 1 percentage point for every one of the 10,000 Black and Hispanic applicants to the University of California. It's not just people who were directly impacted by affirmative action. Actually, it's somewhat difficult to figure out at an individual level who would have gone where if not for the affirmative action policy change. But this is, on average, across all Black and Hispanic applicants to the university. They become less likely by about 1 percentage point to earn $100,000. So if you just add that up, given the fact that there were about 10,000 of these applicants each year, what this adds up as showing you is that if you just count in California right now, how many 30 to 34-year-old Black or Hispanic workers there are in the state who earn at least $100,000 a year. So in the American Community Survey, this adds up to about 22,000, 21,000 people. If affirmative action had not ended, there would have been about 550 more, right? It would have been an increase of about 2.5%. Now, that's modest. I think you should have in the front of your mind, what happens to the California labor market is, I don't know, you can think of it as either big or small, but what's happening is these 550 high earners disappear from the California labor market. Okay, so that's what I'm going to show you about affirmative action. I'll come back to this at the end, but now let me quickly lead you through one of the university's responses to the end of its affirmative action policy, the implementation of eligibility in the local context. So this is a program that was put into place in 2001 and ran in its then form until 2011. So the way ELC worked is that, as I said, it guaranteed admission to 4% of kids from every high school in the state. What does that mean? So these kids are going to get into some University of California campus, but the kids weren't told which University of California campuses would let them in. So let me show you what happened at the various campuses. So for instance, here we have UC Berkeley. So what I've done is lined students up by how close they were to their high school's eligibility threshold. So 0 here is students who are exactly on their school's threshold. They made it into ELC eligibility. Where these students just below the threshold were not ELC eligible. In fact, they were treated just like all other applicants to the various UC campuses. These kids above were treated differently, at least by some schools, because they were ELC eligible. So here's what happens at Berkeley. You can see as students' GPA rises, they're more likely to get into Berkeley. That's obvious. Exactly when they hit the threshold, what happens? Nothing. Berkeley ignores the ELC policy completely, as does UCLA. Students become no more likely to get into Berkeley if they're ELC eligible. But that's not the case at all campuses. So if you look at Davis here in the middle, Davis, students are getting more likely to be admitted as their GPA rises. And then right at their school's threshold, there's a jump. Students become about 20 percentage points more likely to get into Davis if they have GPAs just high enough to clear their high school's threshold. And in fact, 6 of the 9 undergraduate UC campuses guaranteed admission to all ELC eligible students, and a 7th, San Diego, gave a pretty substantial admissions advantage right at this school threshold. That being said, there are some schools like Riverside where the policy really doesn't matter very much. As you can see, at Riverside, even all of these ELC ineligible students, basically all of them are getting in. After all, these are kids with high school GPAs quite close to their school's 96th percentile, right? They're top students at their school. they're already getting into Riverside. So even though Riverside guaranteed admission to these students, they were already guaranteed admission. The policy was practically ineffective at the Santa Cruz, Riverside, and Merced campuses. Now, this is what's happening to students on average across all California high schools. But what you can imagine is that this is a policy that's going to be more impactful the worse the high school is, or at least the lower testing the high school is. At top high schools, top students can already get into most University of California high schools. Where at lower testing high schools, even top students are unlikely to get into highly selective research universities. So what I'm going to do now is show you what these charts look like just for the bottom quarter of California high schools when you rank them by SAT score, average SAT score of top students. And so just look at these graphs for a second, and then I'll click to the graphs for the less selective, the lower tier high schools. I'll just click back once, and then click you to these less selective high schools. What you can see is that Berkeley still isn't participating. Riverside still can't really participate. But at Davis, the admissions advantage is now very big. Students just below the threshold have a 60% chance of getting into Davis. Students just above the threshold have a 100% chance of getting into Davis. So this is a program that's going to radically change the kinds of universities that these students can go to right across the threshold. Let me show you exactly what that change looks like. Here, I'm plotting students' likelihood of enrolling at some University of California campus. And what you can see is that your likelihood of enrolling at UC jumps pretty substantially exactly at this threshold. Why does it jump? It jumps because now we're letting these kids in, and we weren't before. How many of these kids were there? Again, somewhat interestingly, it's similar in magnitude to affirmative action, though the university has grown a lot since then, but it's about 700 or 800 kids a year who are enrolling at the University of California just because of admission under the ELC program. Now, about 50% of these students are Black or Hispanic. Almost all of this is Hispanic. It's about 3% Black. And 58% of these students come from this bottom quartile of California high schools, exactly the schools that were targeted by the ELC program in expectation. A couple more statistics about the students who were provided access to the University of California by ELC in comparison to the average test scores, high school GPAs, and parental incomes of students at the schools that these students ended up enrolling in. These ELC participants had far lower SAT scores by almost 300 points and pretty substantially lower family incomes by about $20,000, though they had similar high school GPAs. That's the whole point. ELC is targeting high GPA, low testing students and providing them access. If you just look at these students from bottom quartile high schools, the gap is even larger. These are students with low national average SAT scores, substantially lower, 400 points lower than their eventual peers at the University of California. And so you might be concerned for these students. They might have a hard time either fitting in or participating and completing coursework at the elite universities they're now enrolling in. Almost all of these students would have otherwise enrolled at local comprehensive universities, the CSU system. So what happens to these students? Well, if you look right across this threshold, you'll see that students just above their high school's threshold become pretty substantially more likely to earn a college degree within the following 5 years. That's a degree from any institution, the University of California or otherwise. And if you link all of these applicants to wages, you can see a pretty sharp increase in average California wages for students just above their high school's threshold. Where do these increases come from? They exactly come from the fact that more of these students are enrolling at elite research universities than these students. Otherwise, there is no difference between these two groups. And if you just try to multiply up, given the change in University of California enrollment happening across this threshold, what should we expect about the impact of the University of California on these students? It adds up to the fact that these students become about 30 percentage points more likely to earn a college degree within 5 years and earn about $15,000 a year more on average. In fact, even more, this is in ages 24 to 26. The jump is even bigger if you exclude people who are enrolled in graduate school at the time. These are still relatively young workers. Very large benefits for these pretty substantially disadvantaged students pulled into the research university. So let me just summarize, tell you a little bit, what have you just learned? What I've hoped to convince you of is, first, that the way both affirmative action and ELC worked was to target specific groups of disadvantaged applicants, and they both succeeded in targeting those groups. Affirmative action targeted Black and Hispanic students within a specific academic index range, where ELC targeted students from largely bottom high schools, but who nevertheless had excellent grades at those high schools. Both programs brought in about 700 to 800 students a year to this selective research university system, and both programs led to long-run benefits for the students who were targeted by these admissions policies, increasing students' likelihood of earning a college degree, earning graduate degrees, and then increasing postgraduate earnings. What happened now to these policies? So again, as I've said, affirmative action has not been implemented by any public university in California since 1998. The story, I think, of ELC is somewhat more disappointing. The university observed that ELC was working, and so tried to expand the program from just 4% of students at every high school to 9% of students at every high school. This expansion occurred in 2012. But the UC campuses uniformly reneged from the policy. Say, UC Davis was willing to take the top 4% of kids from every school, but the top 9% of kids from every school seemed like too much, and so they stopped providing any admissions guarantee. In other words, the program went from 4% of students get to go to almost any University of California campus, except for Berkeley and UCLA, to 9% of graduates from every high school get to go only to UC Merced. Which is a very good university, but which most of these students do not want to enroll at. So take-up of the ELC program since 2012 has been zero. Basically, no one is advantaged by the current ELC program. So I think this was a well-intentioned but ultimately failed UC policy change in 2012. Okay, so what are the takeaways from these findings? So the first takeaway is that access-oriented admissions policies like affirmative action and ELC work in the way that they're intended to. They target disadvantaged students and provide economic mobility to those students in that access to university resources is very valuable for them. You may have heard of this so-called mismatch hypothesis, which claims that affirmative action may be harmful to Black or Hispanic students because it puts those students into settings where they'll have a difficult time competing. That hypothesis does not stand up to scrutiny in the context of California. And I think the way to think about this is that educational quality is a resource that the university and the state has some power to divvy up across individuals. Those students to whom it is provided benefit from its recipients. So these admissions policies work, though they don't always work as intended. It's important to construct these policies carefully. This is relevant this year as the University of California makes a decision about using the SAT in undergraduate admissions. This is a decision that's being made presently. It's easy to make flashy policy decisions. It's often much more difficult to figure out actually how those policies are going to change the admissions behavior of students, the enrollment behavior of students, and the long-run ramifications for those students. Careful deliberation, as the university is implementing now, I think is very important in these policies. And finally, it's worth emphasizing that these policies are politically fragile. So what's nice about university admissions policy is that it's cheap. It doesn't cost anything to get economic mobility by changing which students are admitted to a university. However, for every student who is admitted under one of these policies, there's another student who is not admitted. And that's very challenging from a university or policymaker's perspective. This university resource, this educational resource that's being provided, is limited in a variety of ways. And ultimately, it becomes a zero-sum game of who this resource is provided to. This is also, again, worth emphasizing in the case of the current SAT debate. I think the last thing to say about this political fragility is that while these policies are cheap, they're also modest. So I already showed you that these policies changed dramatically the lives of about 700 kids a year in a state with a population of more than 30 million. This matters, especially for the students who are targeted, but it's not a large-scale economic mobility policy change, unlike many other potential levers available to state government. I'll end there. Everything that I've talked about today is available in far greater detail on my website, and I'd be very happy to take questions from folks.